Hello everyone, today we address certain aspects of the 1683 anti-Ottoman coalition and more specifically the Christian participation to the same in the broader international situation, considering the deep bitterness and disappointment of Leopold I in realizing that Christianity had basically left the Habsburgs alone in this enterprise, right? Albeit he added that the problem of the infidels' offensive was naturally involving the whole Christianity. So this picture naturally had a political meaning in the broader issues that pervaded the same Christendom at the time. The Reformation had split the interests from most countries. Here, the Habsburgs embodied the largest Catholic power, at least in continental Europe, and the one that had contemporarily more interest to fence off the incipient Ottoman invasion of its, say, capital, but even though Vienna was technically not precisely, but was de facto the most important center of the Habsburgic dominions. We already made videos on the papal diplomacy behind the gathering of the 1683 Christian army, where we explained more in detail all the enormous effort that the church made to put this together. I mean, if it hadn't been for them, I mean, we can't say it was the decisive factor, but definitely it's one without the thing could have not taken place. If anything, for the sheer amount of money that the Vatican invested in the in convincing the various princes to take part in the campaign. And today we talk about the, let's say, Leopold's perspective in those months before the Ottomans mobilized properly, when it was realized that the Turks would launch this major offensive. We also made a video about that, which is called Marcia alla Turca, in which we observe also how stealthily the Ottomans operated and how sudden, how risky, right? What a gamble actually the 1683 campaign was. The sheer amount of military resources that it costed and all the attached. So what about Leopold's judgment regarding the disunion of Christendom in front of the Ottoman onslaught? Well, this is kind of obvious. As we were saying before, the French were as enemies to the Habsburgs, and the Ottomans at this point, even in actual strategical capabilities, and of course Paris and Constantinople were allies in this regard. So the also many Protestants in Germany actually preferred Ottoman victory to the spread of the Catholic power, and this is widely known. But we gotta give that, all in all, at this point, especially when John III Sobieski, King of Poland, joined the coalition, the Christian coalition against the Turks. Let's say it wasn't exactly like that, and there is an aspect that we have to stress in here, because we have seen that even that participation was negotiated like each one, and we will make a video on how all the forces eventually were put together practically, because the Habsburgs alone on paper had just 60,000 men, and they wouldn't even be able to levy those, of course. But let's say in the broader process of state building that is investing, Europe at this time, chiefly in the West, in Central Europe, such as in the Habsburgic dominions, it's a bit more, it's a bit slower because of obvious reasons. And therefore, in parallel, what was happening in terms of religious commitment for the sake of, the crusade against the Ottomans, and how in the lack of a concrete modern state that could levy the necessary resources to cope with the threat, the Christian spirit was, however, a gluing factor that had always been there, and was gradually diluting, as we know, historically speaking, through this same improvement, and as the same, I don't know, French policy at that time proved. And however, it was functional to a previous cooperation. I mean, here we're talking literally about the Crusades, right? The Crusades are not a medieval thing. They went on throughout all the modern age. That there was a mentality that, as you know, as a medievalist, I personally don't believe neither a medieval nor a modern age ever existed, because they're just misleading concepts used for the sake of banally, getting the time coordinates here and there, but they're of course completely devoid of any possible meaning that you want to find in them. And the broader issue here is realizing that Christianity had made a tremendous effort overall, right? Modernistic, secularized perspective tended to desecrate a little bit the efforts, the capacities that were actually showed throughout these times by saying, oh, look at these guys, they couldn't even, agree with each other while the Ottomans were swarming in Europe at some point. That we could consider they were bad and were just, they didn't give a damn about religion, and or they didn't even have the capabilities. So there is a bit of contempt both towards what was felt deeply at the time by everybody involved. I mean, even the French in that sense, not because they were substantially different from others, but because politics is something that goes beyond even religion on a regular basis, and that's why this obsession for the concept that these things were just religiously driven is being, a bit the horse that those who criticize such things ride to pretend to say that, religion is flawed and as a stupid thing, superstition. And at the same time, for those times, they basically show contempt towards the fact that at the time there was no state. The fact that, look at the Middle Ages, there was no rule, it was just chaos, anarchy. This is absolutely not true. And not only it's not true, but we gotta give that for the means of the time, these people not only eventually created the states we live in, and it's their fault, not our own, that are just born here randomly and just, talk from the top of I don't know what, essentially these people's accomplishment, but that for those time standards they made an astonishing effort, and even successfully, right? There are other feelings mixed in here, like saying, I don't know, think about Orthodox or Catholics, in regard of the Ottoman advance, leaving aside that it's widely known even in there that many, Orthodoxes preferred at that point the Ottoman rule to the Catholic one. It was profiling when saying, okay, we come rescue you, but you will have to accept the papal tiara, right? And these are, there's an extensive literature on these things. I mean, from proper scientific, academic, authorities. It's not somebody's opinion, floating in the air. And that's the reality of politics. That doesn't take away religion. And for many people, this is very difficult to understand, right? I met both religious and atheist nuts that were fundamentally obsessed about stressing that these were absolutely all about religion. This was absolutely not about religion. And they're both wrong, because it was about both things at the same time. And I presume that censoring one perspective on another is pretty dumb by definition, and that's why you can easily go with a more moderate and more accurate view of the world. Think even of, in that context of the first Ottoman advance in the Balkans and so on, you pick Nicopolis or Varna. Well, you can't really say it. The Westerners were sitting ducks. Indeed, in many ways, they could have done more. But those two expeditions actually were some of the major military operations were led at the time in a world that, let's remember, it was devoid of a center. Right, the same Christendom didn't exist properly as such. I mean, it was a general, a universal idea that we are all Christian. There was an identity, founded on that common thing. But at the same time, there were differences. But this invasion coming from a different faith that, however, incorporated also many, as we've seen, Christian communities, for example, Jews, etc., right? Because you can go as far as pagans at some point, looking at the steppes, even, yes, at that time, was something new that, as I often said when we made videos about the Ottomans, actually contributed massively, but I mean massively, and especially Middle European culture is very aware of that. The rest, not so much, like in Western Europe, it's not so clear. That contributed to define what with all its intersections, etc., what we mean as, in a narrow sense, modern Europe, and Western Europe even. Specifically, because as I was saying before, the Ottoman Empire was full of Christians at all times. They were fighting, even willing, though even those who inhabited outside, right? We will see it now. Think about the Hungarians, Transylvanians, Wallachians, Moldovans. Well, these were, either for love or by force with the Sultan. And that is, how can you read modern Europe if you don't acknowledge these realities? That's quite important. But let's say that Leopold's complaint in that regard was the one of an ecumenic ruler. It was very far by being so de facto, because we know what the Holy Roman Empire was reduced to in practice, but not completely to zero in that kind. But it's obvious that he had to speak from that perspective. But the objective reality of things was otherwise, right? It wasn't true, at least it wasn't completely true, that Christianity had left the Habsburgs alone. Because both the Reich, with the exception of the Rhineland and the Calvinist elector of Brandenburg, had joined the emperor. And aside from the aforementioned Hungarians, Transylvanians, Wallachians, Moldovans that were outside of the empire, of course, that, however, were pressed fundamentally between the empire, the same empire, and the Turks that were under the Sultan, were signing with them, and Poland, and not just Poland, but probably the broader Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, which was a freaking huge thing at the time, were with them, right? With all the difficulties, with internal struggles. We will make a video at some point on the very difficult negotiation with the Commonwealth, Polish policy there, that of course many didn't want. Even in here, the state building thing is crucial, right? Because these universal powers were fundamentally still meaningful in as much they could help to centralize in some way or not. It's obvious that Jan Sobieski had a specific interest as King of Poland that had always been troubled with by the elective nature of its institutional system. In a decentralizing sense, the Polish Szlachta wasn't happy at all of a sovereign gaining too much power, and that's why, by the way, the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth dissolved by the end of the 18th century, following century, which gives you a pretty spot-on idea, but just by these few parameters of how complicated the reality was. Of course, Leopold couldn't realistically expect much from, for example, from Spain, from the Italian states, but not even from England or the Netherlands or the Baltic Scandinavian countries or even of Russia. Albeit the latter of these powers was from its side very interested in the Ottoman problem for their own, especially Black Sea perspective, southern perspective. Here the discriminant is not even here purely religious, right? All these countries had specific, political and strategical interests that and simply possibilities that couldn't objectively make them participate so easily to the. This was assuming proportions as a Middle European problem, chiefly, but consider that Leopold in all this also wasn't feeling particularly well. He was still a perfectly, maybe a bit already anachronistic, considering the most updated political institutional developments, monarchical developments in the West, but he was a very 17th century let's say, times of clash of religions type of sovereign, right? He was depressed, famously enough. He was habitually depressed, and the insecurity was surely sharpening at that point. We will talk better. We already addressed the figure of Father Taviano, all his, the enormous ascendant that these moral religious figures had in the, in catalyzing this broader also international, cooperation, but also backing, influencing the same sovereign. Leopold was lent his ear constantly to Father Taviano. It was also, his spiritual guide and so on. And it ain't easy to deal with a leader that is in this situation, doesn't have quite a firm grip on all the various standards, the various communities of its dominions, properly pre-modern sense, at least by the full statalization perspective. But what probably hurt Leopold the most was the fact that the Pope could not make much more than what was already doing, right, and that he showed himself weak, if not reticent, to incitate and maybe even censor the King of France, because here, of course, the papacy was still, an important authority, internationally speaking, but they had to be cautious, considering the role of France's ascendant that was renowningly, backing the Sublime Gate at that point. But nobody could really tell much because of France as the most Catholic kingdom, and in the sense champion of Christianity. It was becoming fundamentally an hegemonic power because of the military reforms of the Sun King, and that could extend its reach. Even the Sun King sent its navy in Italy, threatened the same northwestern areas. I mean, there was a concrete risk to denounce French support to the Ottomans. The French also sent some help eventually to the Habsburgs formally, because they had to show they did something. Of course, they mostly, but it's not because they were wicked in any sense. I mean, that's realpolitik, right? These guys knew that by, the Ottomans by Vienna were overstretched. Of course, the fall in 1683 would have caused enormous changes. France would have, at that point, had to take the lead against the Ottomans, a bit like what happened in the 20s of the 6th century, right? France was backing the Ottomans, but, they weren't happy that was, such threat would have, but it was either them or the Habsburgs anyway. For them, for the kingdom, it was better at that point to back the perspective that, say the side that had actually least capabilities, because as we were saying before, even Vienna from Constantinople was at the limits of the Ottoman logistical capabilities to reach in the northern frontier. So even the Ottoman threat naturally must be given a realistic dimension. You would have never seen the Turks arriving at the Thames mouth, right, had they be stopped at Vienna. They were already actually spending themselves enormously for not just for this campaign, but for maintaining constantly an empire stretched from the Ukraine to Sudan, from Hungary to the Persian Gulf, and that obliged them to be at war basically on 3-4 fronts contemporarily, right? And you even wondered there how the hell did the Ottomans even made it to last up to the 20th century? Well, by the 19th, it's obvious that the Westerners basically maintain it for their own interest. But in this time, this first century, I mean, that was an enormous, gigantic effort, extraordinary effort, that must be acknowledged, of course. And there was a same ambiguous and temporizing attitude from the side of the Serenissima, because Venice also, at this point, had spent itself, had bled itself white, and bled the same Ottoman Empire almost white with the War of Candia. And, of course, they had an interest to, as we have already hinted at, by 1683-84, to resume the war against the Ottomans, invading Morea and seizing that for a while. But they were just Venice by themselves. Doesn't matter how rich, but still, after the war, Candia definitely declining as a superpower compared to the early modern standards where they had been. So also what escaped Leopold's mind, or at least that maybe he wouldn't want to confess himself, was the sensation, if not the awareness, in the sense that a united and conquered Christianity in the name of the faith didn't exist anymore, and that the in relation to it, the real Christian Europe was already another thing. I mean, there are such realizations at some point in history, especially in this case when you see such a speedy transformation in countries such as France, but even more the Netherlands, England, and then a power like the Habsburgic one that was fundamentally still lagging behind, in spite of being representative of this most glorious Roman Christian past that the empire embodied, and that had theoretically to surpass all others in powers, which evidently wasn't like that. So for a sovereign, that's what we rarely try to do. That is, trying to imagine what of course we can't fully, but we must at least make it effort of thinking what could be the mindset of a 17th century Holy Roman Emperor. And there is such a deep adherence to certain values that today we don't even understand. We can't even understand anymore properly, maybe even rational. But at the time, we're functional still to that world. It's very hard. And let's consider also that Leopold was a man of profound and refined culture, surely superior on average to the other European leaders of his time, and he therefore could not ignore, even just obscurely and confusedly, the great crisis of conscience of the entire Europe approach, right? And 1683 is, in a sense, the symbol of it, and it would trigger for the same Habsburgs eventually a lot of things that would make them take off essentially as a more modern power, and eventually as one of the greatest powers in the 18th, 19th century. Now, in spite of this, and this is where we get to the point, the force of tradition in Europe was still robust and well present, both at an institutional and, let's say, at a common, widespread level of feeling. And the emergency of the moment, in the face of the Ottoman onslaught, contributed to make it come back on the fore, re-emerge. So Pope Innocent XI was rendering, at this point, already explicit the tones of crusade. In April, he ordered that, quote, from all the faithful had to be implored the divine help, so that his divine majesty will deign himself by his infinite mercy and for the merits of our Redeemer to disappoint every attempt of the persecutors of his holy name, and to crush with the power of his right their fierceness. And on April the 26th, Jacopo Antonio Morigia published the news that the papacy had granted the plenary indulgence to those who would have visited between May the 2nd and the 4th the most holy exposed in the cathedral according to the papal intentions. In Rome, it was the Pope to preside the rites that he himself had predisposed and that contemplated all over Italy the publishing of prayers and the exposition of the Most Holy Sacrament. The Pope multiplied the appeals for defense, he had at this point, as we have said, convinced King John III of Poland to the maximum effort, even beyond other commitments that he had assumed with the emperor. This is important because, as we'll see now, there were problems with the same imperial decisions. It had to be the commander-in-chief. So the papacy had paid extra money to fundamentally convince the Poles to participate. The Polish sovereign had thus acquired by this point the centrality of his role, right? He needed, however, an adequate recognition, because he, for example, didn't want to be anything but the commander-in-chief, and instead it was exactly in this that certain doubts were thickening in spite of the letter of the Polish Imperial Treaty. And the papers spoke clearly, but the bad moods and unsatisfactions mounted, and John feared certain last-hour change in this game. And in this sense, you have to read the thick correspondence between the quote intimate royal secretary for the things of Italy, the Lucchese Tommaso Talenti, that was working on behalf of the Poles, and the Cardinal Carlo Barberini. And you realize in here how the channel was not specifically the Polish imperial one, but the Polish papal one, right? So, and this tells you the weight of the papacy at the time of the same Father Daviano, the council, the Leopold. So everything was intertwined at that point. And after the agreement of the pact between the emperor and the king of Poland, Innocent XI had turned for military or financial help also to all the Italian states, and the Tuscan promise of funds and the employment of Saint Stephen's galleys had been deemed by the same Pope elusive in a sense, even if the government of the Grand Duchy had actually contributed with war material that had been sent to the emperor and 100,000 florins to Poland. And money contributions had come also from Genoa, Lucca, Massa, from Savoy, and other lesser states. The same cardinals privately participated with good sums of money to the common effort, and naturally also the Pope gave a generous example. Without this money, an army could not be gathered in the first place, and the first fundamental and authentic supreme guide of the Christian army was not to be debated. It would have not been the emperor's one, because he was not an experienced soldier, and the commander-in-chief of the Habsburgic imperial group would have received instructions through the same Aufkriegsrat, to which he would have had to answer. But according to a vote contracted by Ferdinand III that Leopold I had renewed in 1676 during a pilgrimage to Mariazell, the Virgin Mary had been the generalissima of all the imperial armies in time of war and imperial plenipotentiary in time of peace. The effigy of the Virgin had been embroidered or painted over the imperial standards, as over the ones of the Holy League. In those years, the pious opinion relative to the Immaculate Conception, albeit still not having been defined as a dogma, which, as you know, would actually happen in 1854 with the encyclical Ineffabilis Deus by Pius IX, was ever more spread, an object actually very lively cult by those heralds to that were mostly embodied by the Jesuits and the Franciscans. And it's from the same Father Staviano epistolary that we learn with how much frequency the Virgin was venerated, quote, under the title of Mary, Help of Christians, in the clash against the Turks. So the cult of Mary, helper of Christians, Auxilium Christianorum, would have spread dizzyingly after the siege of Vienna. And in fact, there's plenty of monuments. Consider that in August 1693, the emperor, participated in St. Stephen in Vienna to a solemn vow to the Virgin, Celi terreque regina and auxilium Christianorum. Naturally, the Virgin was not asked to respond to the Aufkriegsrat, so that the title of Commander-in-Chief of the Habsburg Imperial Army in its world would have been given to to Leopold's brother-in-law, Charles V, Duke of Lorraine, as we've seen also from the Prince Eugen series. That was solemnly entrusted with it, conferred with it on May the 6th, after the Virgin Mary, right, such as the supreme guide of the imperial armies. That would create quite of a problem with the King of Poland, but we have already seen it elsewhere, and we'll talk about that again. For now, I would say we can stop here, but this was just to give maybe an extra information about the vision, the propaganda, the political negotiation, the belief, the faith that surrounded this broader reality, the different interests, the different countries, and especially the ultimate problem of unity of command that in the face of a major invasion must be achieved in a world that is not used to gather with that single intention as we have seen, and that instead managed to do that and incapable of even of overthrowing the situation, almost actually, because they didn't reach Constantinople, but they surely passed an offensive that would fuel further this statal capacity and yet change the history of Europe in a deep way at that point. But we will talk about this again, as we were saying before. For now, I just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming content. And for now, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.